So I'm Amy Weishart. I'm the director of the Heartland Public Library. And I thank you very much for coming. This is a Vermont Humanities Council event, so I want to acknowledge them and thank them for sponsoring this event. They have a sign-up sheet that I have in the back of the room if you want to get emails from them about Vermont Humanities Council programs. I also have an email list for the Heartland Public Library, as well as evaluations that for this program. If you want to take one and fill one out at the end of the program, that would be great. So we're very pleased to welcome James Sturm tonight. He is a cartoonist and a co-founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction. His notable works include Adventures in Cartooning, The Golem's Mighty Swing, and Market Day. His work has appeared in many publications, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, The Onion, The New York Times, Slate, and on the cover of The New Yorker. He is also the co-founder of the Seattle newspaper, The Strange, and he's a Heartland resident.
I felt like there was almost no need to, everybody knows me here. Just me walking my dogs and sharing meals and whatnot. Well, thank you. Thanks for the Vermont Humanities Council, and thank you, Amy, for helping hosting this event. It's really fun to be here. And I'm going to get a little wonky about comics, and Comics Reconsidered is the name of the talk. It's interesting because, when you're invited to do this Vermont Humanities Council, they ask you to, say what you're going to, what you're going to talk about. And you never really know. You write a description, and then you hope it works out like a year later, and that's what you're interested in talking about. So basically, this is a snapshot of where I'm at right now and thinking about comics, and hopefully everybody will learn a little something about comics too. And I'm probably going to talk for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes tops. And then if you have any questions, we can start a dialogue. And if you got to get home and eat, I understand that too. All right, so without further ado, as Amy said, I'm a co-founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies, and we started that about 10 years ago. So usually on anniversaries and birthdays, you start a little bit of reflection. I co-founded this with Michelle Holly, and in a way, the founding of the school was trying to reconsider comics. Now, when I was kind of coming of age, comics were about superheroes and comic strips, and or my sisters, Betty and Veronica comics. And a lot of times we think we know what these are about because the formats are so familiar and the characters are so familiar. But I remember once I was at my friend Art Baxter's place when I was living in Philadelphia, and he's like, "Did you see today's Family Circus?" And I said, "No." And he's like, "Well, Bill Keane, who's since passed away, it's a family business, a lot of these strips. Beetle Bailey, he still works out of Mort Walker in the 90s or late 80s now. And same with Bill Keane's family. His son took it over, but he still wrote the strips every once in a while. And you could always tell the strips that he was writing because they would be grandma. So like in this strip, for those who can't read, it says, instead of time marching on the way it used to, now it seems to be running out. So you have grandma in a dark room, looking over. You see her back. She's looking over her shoulder. Her eyes are really. She looks tired. It's sunset outside. I'm assuming. There's a bare tree with no leaves. There's not a piece of art on the wall. So comics is clearly a misnomer. So. We associate, though, comics with certain styles in conventions. And in just my generation, comics went from Archie and Dilbert, Batman, Betty and Veronica, to include things like this. This is a cartoonist named Gary Panter on the left, and this is a German cartoonist who's working like Aisha Franz as well. And when I was in high school, my goal was to, I love Marvel Comics, and I wanted to, write and draw the Fantastic Four someday, or a comic like that. And as I went to college and I learned more about art, and I realized I couldn't draw in that way, I thought I had to give comics up because I didn't know that there were other types of comics besides what I showed. And seeing work like this and cartoonists who are trying to express more idiosyncratic personal vision has really emerged in the medium over the last decade. So the idea for starting the Center for Cartoon Studies was to establish a school where comics is a medium. It's not a genre. And this is something that often comes up when people talk to me. They're like, I love comics, I love Batman, or I love comics, I and they conflate genre and medium. And it was a school where individual artists would find their own voice and style. And I figured at the time that there was all these schools where, scores of schools, hundreds of schools, where you could get an MFA in painting or sculpture or poetry, but there was this prejudice against comics back in the day. And a lot of the cartoonists that I most admired were always reconsidering the form. In around 2005, when the school was formed, there was a lot of momentum with comics. It seemed like it was gaining a cultural currency. Comics were beginning to win literary awards and be included in major art exhibitions. Each of these cartoonists, they really explored what the medium was capable of. Excuse me. Jules Feiffer and Gary Trudeau, reinventing the newspaper comic strip, and Art Spiegelman creating a classic series memoir that really announced the arrival of the graphic novel. Alison Bechdel, with her graphic novel Fun Home, did the same thing. And we were fortunate, and I was very fortunate that before starting the cartoon school, I still am a working cartoonist, and that's, I feel like I'm a cartoonist first and a / educator. And I'd established myself to the extent that all these folks were able, came through the school early on to establish a certain amount of legitimacy to the enterprise. So the students remarkably showed up, and they started writing and drawing their own comics, and we've had a lot of great alumni making work, and we've also had fellows over the last 10 years where somebody who has more experience than a student but still establishing their own networks and getting known, they would come from Belgium, a fellow from South America who might be coming next year. And in fact, April 1st, we're having an opening at the Society of Illustrators in New York City and Manhattan. We're really excited by that. That's going to be 10 years of fellowship of work that the fellows have made over the last 10 years. This is a book, Meanwhile, in White River Junction, by one of our former fellows. So CCS got established, and we kind of did what we hoped to do. But again, 10 years later, it's like you're always things never stand still. You're always reconsidering. And we bought this old post office in White River Junction, and it feels like a real school now, right? Like, that looks like an institution. And when you're a cartoonist, it's like the history of cartooning in some ways is like the history of subversion. And all of a sudden you're not on the outside looking in, right? Like, it's not academia, for instance. There's all these other programs out there now that have been established in the last 10 years. Comic art studies programs, courses at bigger universities. A lot of our graduates are landing jobs, tenure track positions at art and design colleges and universities. So that certainly has changed in the last 10 years. And then, of course, there's just been this beachhead of amazing work that keeps coming and coming. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Fun Home or Ross Chaff's memoir. And it seems like every couple of years it's like a major book that really is in the middle of some kind of cultural conversation. So that's another thing that's changed over the last 10 years. But when I really think of comics now, or I should say in the broadest sense, when I think of 2005 and 2015, what's really changed is our culture and how we communicate with one another. We're more wired than ever. Our primary modes of communication are pictorial. Emoji, Tumblr, Vimeo, Snapchat. Like, were these even words 10 years ago? I'm amazed. Like, when I'm texting with my daughters, or I see my youngest Snapchatting with their friends, it's all visual communication now. So you could say the age of the typewriter is gone. And I know. How many people still use a typewriter with a ribbon?
I have some. I don't.
Good. Give her air. Rare breed. We'll have to. Yeah. Okay. But truth be told, like when you're putting together a newsletter, a business proposal, or a public lecture, or even just corresponding like my daughter does with her friends, we are using iPhones, tablets, computers, and they're image writers, not typewriters. So writing with pictures, the art of writing with pictures is embedding narratives into visual architecture. And that all sounds like very buzzwords for information architects, but that is what we do. Writing with pictures is embedding narrative into visual architecture. And comics does this awfully, awfully well. A few years back in 2001, I was working on a book called The Golem's Mighty Swing that Amy mentioned. And a friend of mine sent along some of these Japanese manga. And I was just amazed, not reading Japanese, I could read a 250-page graphic novel about a baseball team and understand the personalities, get absorbed in the game, and it was all through pictorial communication. And on a very obvious level, you see, in manga you read opposite, so you see someone pitching, somebody waiting for a pitch, here comes the ball, somebody swings and he hits the ball. And you're like, all right, well if that's all you get out of that, that's a lot, right? So there is this information architecture at play. But when you look at all the other devices this cartoonist is using, you have all these like blurred motion-y lines, right? And then you have him kind of, in just the angle of his body, and you have him kind of standing straight up. He's kind of wiggling his hands. He's if you've ever watched baseball, he's got that Charlie Lau raising the leg up. And then you have this big ball with almost like sand underneath it. It looks like this effect. And this ball almost like it stops. You ever, if a ball, usually a ball is like a blur, but if you can actually count the stitches on a ball, it's standing still. So suddenly he looks surprised. He has this little surprise thing going on. He's already put his foot down, and here comes the bat, but it's not all the way through. He's reacting to it. But now the ball, instead of like whoosh, it's almost like dropping in at an angle, and he's lunging his body. He's with one hand off the bat. He's made contact, not with one of those home run swings, but with like a little tip that he's kind of sent the ball dribbling. And I don't read Japanese, but I know that like he was fooled. He was expecting a fastball, and he got a curveball. And all of that is in that drawing, right? And that's what I find so remarkable about comics. And this is Shinji Mitsushima. And these are Shonen Championship manga. And these were done in the late 70s and early 80s. And baseball comics in the States really were very, very poor. Because baseball is a game that really takes its time and unfolds slowly. So if you try to tell a baseball story like some cartoonists did in like a 4-panel cartoon strip, it's very clipped and it feels unnatural. Or even a 6-page story. There'd be scenes in this baseball comic that, just a pitcher trying to pick off a batter at first base, and it would be like 20 pages. And loved it. Okay. I can talk about baseball. I can pick up the Mets here.
Did you ever find out what the text actually says?
I did, and I've forgotten. I actually had one of my Japanese students who translated it. I have it written down somewhere. Some of it's sound effects, but
I wonder if that's a Japanese ball player.
they all take place in Japan. They do. So, as comics change, or excuse me, as the world changed, it seems like everyone's reading comics in a way, right? When I read 4 emojis, my daughter thought it was funny while my wife was driving my daughters home from Boston this weekend, and she texted me this almost like a glass of wine, an ambulance, and a hypodermic needle, or something, like these little emojis telling this story, like, oh, mom's driving, liquored up. It's like, okay, and we just started emojiing back and forth, of making a little story going back and forth. But what I'm seeing now is that we're asking, what if comics aren't simply a quaint feature of geek culture, but the way the world processes information? And one of the things I think is special about comics is it's a very unpretentious and instantly engaging medium. And I think of them almost as like the source code for communication in the digital age. And by learning this code, comics teach us the fundamental skills that will allow us to more effectively use all the various media we now have at our disposal. I've talked to so many educators that want to get computers in the classrooms earlier and earlier, thinking that this will help prepare students for the 21st century. And I feel like a pencil and paper and lesson plans built around comics can do the same thing of learning how to communicate visually. Scott McCloud, the author of Understanding Comics, he calls cartooning a form of amplification through simplification. The Charlie Hebdo killings spurred a worldwide debate on how images are read. Art Spiegelman, the author of Mouse, who I mentioned earlier, said that one takeaway from Charlie Hebdo was the need to teach visual literacy in all schools. And his quote was, "We're bombarded with images more and more, and we have less and less time to understand them. What's amazing about these simple drawings is that they stand still long enough for you to circle them and get around them in ways you often can't with videos." Art's wife, Françoise Millet, also happens to be the art director for the covers of The New Yorker, and she has created, she's started a publishing house like 8 or 9 years ago called Toon Books. And it's a children's, it's a publishing house that's dedicated to using comics to teach both traditional and visual literacy. And a quote from her says, "When it's done well, a cartoon can actually not be a reduction, but a summation and a distillation of complex ideas." Every week we get an email at the cartoon school people looking for different projects, looking for cartoonists. And a lot of them aren't credible, so to speak, but a lot of them turn into something. This was a project for Ben and Jerry's, and they had there was one of the guys that worked on the line, and he started making these comics to help train people on the line, to avoid craters in the food and dealing with allergens. And everybody just loved them, and they stapled them together, and they shared them at conferences, and they realized, like, we want to do this for real. This guy did these great little comics, but they wanted to make it a little more professional looking and get it done more often, and the guy was full-time on the line. So they contacted the school. We put him in touch with one of our local alumni, and he started producing these comics, and there's at least 2 of them out now. And they're really just for internal purposes, but it's a fun way to get train workers. This is another project that CCS has been involved with. We worked with DHMC. They have an Innovation and Design Center, and they were restructuring DHMC, and the leadership wanted to sell their vision on what they need to do in the coming years to continue to deliver excellent healthcare while staying solvent. Always important. And they wanted to address why they had to change, why they were restructuring, what they were going to do, and they knew that in order to win hearts and minds, they needed not only the information, but it had to be told in a compelling way. So using this cartoonist skill set, we helped them with their presentation. Another place I'm seeing comics out in the world, we're seeing in the last few years the rise of something called graphic journalism. When you think of a lot of the journalism we consume on television, a camera goes into a place and it's like a vacuum, and it quickly sucks out images, and then they regurgitate it. The hand is a slow and methodical witness. When something's hand-drawn, you have to spend a lot of time with it. Every cartoonist can tell you that from experience. And the hand of an individual reporter, I think, also immediately dispels the misleading conceit of objectivity and connects the story to an audience in a more intimate way. Another place that I'm seeing comics out in the world, beyond publishing, is comics being used to facilitate communication and deepen understanding between cultures, between socioeconomic groups. One of CCS's instructors is a guy named Merrick Bennett. Maybe some of you are familiar with. He's done a lot of workshops in New Hampshire. Really wonderful educator, and he's led some trips to Nicaragua. And he uses comics to teach literacy to families of coffee growers. And they in turn then teach him and American audiences how coffee gets from Nicaragua to New England. And he makes these wonderful comics with coffee growers, kids of the coffee growers. Another place where comics is kind of being embraced, there's internationally a growing movement. I was just at the ALA conference in Boston, and I was really thrilled to see at the Penn State University had a whole graphic medicine imprint. This scholar, Paul Gravitt, said, something remarkable and game-changing is being sparked by the alliance between comics and medicine. It's becoming clear that these graphic narratives can deepen understanding not only of facts, but of feelings between patients, families, and professionals. So that sounds good, but what does that mean in practice? About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and there still is a lot of news about returning veterans. And I realized I had driven by the VA about 1,000 times since I've lived here. And I really had never gone in. The cartoon school was a mile away from the VA. And it seems like those two worlds never met. And I thought, well, how do you try to, what makes a community but trying to knit these things together? So I started volunteering there, thinking that maybe comics could, be a device to reach out. And I was working at the volunteering at the psych ward in the residential recovery unit. And I was trying to figure out ways to engage with veterans using comics. And this falls under, I didn't know what graphic medicine was at that point, but since then I've been invited to go talk about it, where I gave a keynote speech at Johns Hopkins a year ago about the work that we've done there. So if you go online and you research veterans at all, as I was preparing, you'll find these lists of things you shouldn't say to veterans, and that could kind of be insensitive even if you're well-meaning. So I took a lot of old New Yorker gag panels, and I stripped out the caption, and then I asked the vets that were in the session, I was like, well, what are some of the insensitive things people say to you? And we wrote those out on cards, and then we took the drawings, and then we took the images, and we tried to pair them together. And so, well, at least you made it back. And that was the reaction. We got some good laughs. And it was a way of kind of taking that thing that's toxic, right? And then finding humor with it. So, of course, there's the desert island gag. And no, I don't want to go for a drink. So there was things like that. At least you didn't kill anybody, or did you kill anybody? How could you leave your kids? So it was just spending time there and just kind of trying to start figuring stuff out that I learned so much about what comics can do. In the psych ward, there was a lot of people suffering from PTSD, and one of the things with PTSD is you have a hard time reconciling past, present, and future. Those things don't all seem to belong on the same page. And when you think about comics, right, you're creating pages where a panel, which is a discrete unit of time, is sitting, arranged on a page, so you have past, present, and future all together, that work together. So there was one, there was a few weeks that I was in there, and there was one vet that just was really out of it, heavily medicated, I assumed. Just kind of stared at the TV, was just out of it, and first few weeks, he barely looked up or acknowledged me. And I thought, all right, as I got more comfortable there and I got a little more confident, I sat down with him, and I had these little pieces of paper, 4x4, in a plastic sleeve, that was like a grid, like six panels a page in this grid, and I just started to do his tattoo, and he saw me drawing. He perked up a little bit. I was like, oh, what's up with that too? And he started talking. He's like, oh, I'm too tired, man. I have too many racing thoughts. So then I drew a little card, racing thoughts, and I just started putting together what he was saying to me, and all of a sudden, half an hour later, a story came out about what he was going to have to go home soon, and he lived in this home, and this incident with this brown paper bag lunch that he didn't get, and it was very satisfying to this medium that I love to see it used in another way. And for the longest time, I always thought of every comic I did, I worked hard and I fussed over it, and I realized like this type of cartooning. There's a guy I'm working with right now named Kurt Schaffer. He's the chaplain at the West Haven VA in Connecticut. He's hoping to move here and kind of do more, and he's doing this thing he calls process cartooning, where it's not about the final product, but it's about the process of making it and the process of using it to communicate. So from almost a year of kind of volunteering, and I pulled some students in from the cartoon school to local artists to talk about their work. We put together a little program there, cartoonists seeking stories, and we paired cartoonists up with veterans, and we're doing a little anthology of work. If you Google comic veteran NHPR, you'll get a great NHPR story about some of the work that they did during one of the events. And we'll have a little an anthology is going to be printed later this year, and we'll have a little exhibition up at the VA too. So all of this, as I look out, and in my heart, I still want to make books and create graphic novels, and that's very important to me. This solitary work as a cartoonist I do. But as I look out to this kind of changing landscape out there, I see this really important role that cartooning can play to become an agent of change in medicine, in different areas. And as I reconsider comics, to go back to the title of the talk, I'm kind of calling it applied cartooning. And just as in there's applied science and applied math, applied engineering, I feel like the work I do as my books is like the pure, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, where I'm the audience of one, and I'm exploring something much more personal. And I feel like with the applied cartooning, it's taking the lessons I learned about the medium and creativity and bringing it out into the world and trying to connect with the world around us. And the various ways that it can work. And that is now 10 years later is one of kind of another track that we're trying to build on at the cartoon school. What's been amazing is we've done a few workshops, and to be able to do these workshops and then see someone like this Reverend Kurt Schaffer go out and then use some of these tools out in the community, it's incredibly satisfying to see and feel like, okay, we could be onto something as well. So this is where I'm at in terms of reconsidering cartooning. And I have only one more slide, and it's not so connected to everything, but it's Nancy, and I love Nancy. So I'm gonna leave you with Nancy, because and maybe it is connected, because what you do as a cartoonist is you string together a few simple pictograms to quickly engage and connect and charm and maybe even inform an audience. And 4 panels, and we have love, jealousy, and retribution. It's like Dostoevsky, like boiled down. And I love how the word squish just gets redefined. Yeah. So that's kind of like where I'm at thinking about reconsidering comics. And I'd love to open it up for a dialogue if anybody's interested in chatting.
Yeah, John, you opened your talk making a distinction, cartooning genre versus medium. I
Yeah.
wonder if you might flesh that out. I mean, I'm sure you've been showing us examples.
Right. So when I was kind of in high school, I thought like if you couldn't draw in this highly mannered style of Superman or Batman, you're not a cartoonist. Genre is basically superheroes. It's really weird what happened with American comics. At some point, like superheroes became this dominant genre, and whether they were selling books or not selling books, it didn't matter. Like superheroes defined the medium, and it would be like in the 50s, Hollywood, making westerns or something, and then the westerns stopped making stopped making money, and they're like, well, we're still going to do westerns. And for 30 years, all they do is westerns. Like, no, they do westerns and romance and buddy movies, and it just jumps around to all those traditional genres. And somehow with comics, and there's reasons for that, I guess, but for the most part, and you could maybe say like these billion-dollar Avenger movies are reaping the rewards of being so steadfast in that, with these characters, but maybe that's another conversation. But that's what I mean by genre. Yeah, it's like funny animals, little humor, superheroes. Yeah, whereas comics can be cookbooks, they can be travelogues, memoirs, historical fiction, romance, it could be.
How important is drawing style or skill? I'm not sure which I mean.
That's a great
to
question.
conveying the message. And the reason I ask is because some comics are, to my eyes, clear and crisp and well drawn.
Right.
And other ones just look like somebody whipped them off in 30 seconds.
Right.
And some of them, those ones can be so hard to look at that it's hard to get the message out.
Right. So this is a question about aesthetics,
Yeah.
and it's also, well, I guess one thing is, if it's meant to be shared, it's really important, right? If I'm doing quote unquote process cartooning, and I'm drawing someone's tattoo, and that's engaging us, I don't care if this comic is so great, if it's having the desired effect of facilitating a relationship. But I think it's everything. There's the great painter, printmaker, WPA photographer Ben Shawn, and he gave a series of lectures at Harvard in the 50s called The Shape of Content. And basically he said that you can't divorce shape and content. In cartooning, like for instance, I'll use an example. If you take one of these like superhero guys, and sometimes you look at these superhero comics and they look like pornographic images, right? Like the women with their silicone breasts, half naked, and the men. I mean, it
There are
looks
any
like
pictures of that?
Later.
There's plenty on the internet. I can guarantee you that. And they move too. So if you took one of these superhero guys and he was going to write a comic about feminism, before you even, read a word about that, you would look at the format and the highly mannered style. That's just, we accept that as what superhero comics look like. And in that sense, the comic, the style is integral to its message. And when you look at something, whether it's the clean line of like Hergé or something a little more casual, comics a friend of mine also told me that that reading a comic should be like falling off a log in the water. Like it should be really easy to do. And if it's not, then you certainly have a problem. But the style certainly speaks to the content for sure. And I always think about that with comics too, because comics is a language. People think that comics is about writing and illustration, but in reality, I believe comics has more in common with poetry and graphic design. It's graphic design because you want to kind of instantly communicate, but if it was just that, reading a comic would be like reading a series of traffic signs: yield, stop, start. It's the poetry that makes it sing, that gives it some soul. The arrangement of elements on a page. I always think like when I look at a comic, thinking about a language, the great Harvey Kurtzman, who was the founder of Mad Magazine, or Mad Comic, that became Mad Magazine, he thought of a comic page, of a comic book, as every tier, a tier is a row of comics, as like a sentence, in every page a paragraph. And every panel has to have proper diction. So if I have a panel, a story, and it's about a kid who's being put to sleep, and he's asleep, and he has a nightmare, and somebody's reading that story, and they get to a panel, and all they see is like some crazy quilt, pattern on a quilt and wallpaper, and then it takes them a while to see the kid sleeping in the bed. Like, all of a sudden that information hierarchy is askew, and I'm not doing my job as a cartoonist articulating that. And in the same way with comics too, when you talk about style, there is that sense of in writing we call it purple prose, right? Like too much ornamentation. And in comics you could have purple images. I mean, like you could be overly illustrious, and you can lose the focus of your diction. And depending on what you're trying to accomplish as a cartoonist. I mean, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it might not be. It all depends on your goal when you're trying to communicate. Back there, and then Jeff.
There's also a set of conventions that have to be shared between the cartoonist and the reader.
Yeah.
Things like the lines that show motion, or
right.
What the fact that you read from left, right. The Japanese comic that you showed us, if you hadn't explained that they read that way,
right.
And there were some things in that cartoon, though there were things that looked like staples, kind of. Yeah. That I don't know what that means.
Right.
That's a convention that we don't have. So even like our language, written language, has punctuation marks that you have to learn.
Absolutely.
Those things help us do.
Yeah.
Road signs too have, we might not be able to read the word stop, but we know it's shaped like that.
Yeah, early film, like when they first did like edits and cuts, it's like, what? Like, why are we like outside the train now? We were just inside the train. And then slowly we accumulate, certain, we become familiar with that. And I think we're in the process of that happening for sure. But it's certainly, it's a language. For the longest time when I was reading those Japanese comics, there was one of the characters had this alfalfa thing that would just grow out of his lower jaw. It was like really odd. And then when he was depressed, it would droop, and when he was excited, it would get. And so I could see how it was kind of like this emotional barometer. But I asked one of my students, I was like, one of my Japanese students, I said, like, well, like, why does this character have this in his mouth but no one else does? And she puzzled over it a little bit and she said, you know what, you have the hayseed character, and we're all familiar with that convention, the hayseed with the, it's like that, he's a hayseed. It's like, oh, okay, now it makes sense. So it did translate, but there's a word for it, animata, is that it? But there's a word for those little indicators, like, like I know in manga there'd be like a drop coming out of the nose showing sleep. Is that right? Yeah. So there is stuff that's not necessary. That some of it's universal, some of it's not.
I wonder if you could talk some about the work you're doing with medicine. I've had the luxury of being at the VA for 2 years now, and it's really impressive that very good medical people and students know one of the vets' last 4 of their Social Security, and they know their medicines. They don't know the people at all. I am certain that if you were to just ask after someone had done an interview, oh, so where was he in the war, or do you know about, that they wouldn't know that information. And I remember listening in when you had some people do some stories of, some vets do some stories of their past using cartoons. I'm just wondering if there isn't something there in helping present day medical people and students learn more about how to learn about who people are, that they're more than their blood sugar, they're more than their last 4, and maybe that using cartooning is a way to engage those sides of a story.
Yeah, and so this is what we're really interested in doing. And as a volunteer, you go in and you're in, you're out, and it's kind of this position that you're doing in between, all your other obligations. What we're trying to do is to find the funding to be able to go in and establish a program where we explore this in a little more deliberate way. Kurt Schaffer, the chaplain, he has done what he says over close to 1,000 of this exercise, where he does like this 3-panel comic. He did it with me as an example, where he tries to really connect, and he deals with people, in trauma, a lot of times people at the end of life, and he finds using this cartoon exercise model, and it's almost like somebody's almost describing a comic to him, and he arranges it like it's almost so simple in stick figures, but he's having tremendous success with it, like more so than any other thing that he's tried. And here's a guy that teaches at the EDL Divinity School and has a lot of clinical background. So we've been talking about how do we now fund a study? How do you show that this stuff's effective so you can then take the next step? It's one thing for me to go in and feel like, oh yeah, this is happening, and I can feel it. But of course, that's not good enough in a clinical environment. So it's certainly something that we'd like to. And this isn't. It's just a different twist on just, I think, probably a lot of traditional art therapy models as well. Wow, we're doing good.
James, can you recommend a good history of cartooning? I imagine it has a long history, in many ways politically.
Yeah.
Something you could recommend that maybe we should have in the library? Maybe?
Good. I don't know. It's interesting. For the longest time, the history of comics was the history of the industry of comics. So any history of comics was about the superheroes or about the comic strips. And there was a guy, Dan Nadell, who did a book called Art Out of Time. And he started exploring into the nooks and crannies of the industry and finding kind of the outliers and the weirdos who were doing idiosyncratic work, either within those industries or outside of those industries. But in terms of a comprehensive book, it's such a huge field. It's like, well, what's a history of the right books? You'd have to boil it down. There's certainly a lot of good, and I don't, I hope I don't sound like I'm disparaging comic strips or superheroes. I love both of those things. But I think that big history, it's better just kind of break it down into littler bits depending on your area of interest.
I just wonder if there's a word for a comic that doesn't imply comedy.
I think Alison Bechdel called her book a commie tragedy or something like that. There's been so many, over the course of the decades, so many people have tried to rebrand comics, and we're just stuck with comics. Fortunately, unfortunately, because it is very misleading. But people have called it graphic novels, social comment art. The New Yorker cartoonist Alan Dunn called it in the 50s. There's all kinds of rebranding that has gone on, and it just always kind of comes back to comics. I think the Italian word is fumetti, which is kind of nice, which I believe means little puffs of smoke, which describes the word balloons, and there's something kind of sweet about that as well. I'm sorry. And then, go ahead.
Is cartooning an expression specifically for Western culture?
No, it is not. Japan has a rich.
Yeah, but there's
I see what you mean.
Japan bases, what I understand from your lecture, back on the European or Western cartooning. But is there also a cartooning in another part of the world?
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I was asked to write an introduction to a collection of African cartooning, and a few years ago that was being done at the Harlem Museum in New York, and I looked at the work, and it seemed like it was work that I was looking at in America in terms of aesthetics from 30 years ago, and I couldn't find a way in to talk about it. It was beyond me at that point, to be honest with you. I know, like traditionally, like in a Native American culture, a lot of the narrative works were done like with craft and weaving. But it's interesting how we think about the history of comics. A lot of times in this country, we think, oh, Western, comics started with the yellow kid in the newspapers. But when you look at things like Indian ledger drawings, these are comics. Like they have every quality of cartooning are in these Indian ledger drawings. And if people don't know about those, they're basically ledgers that you write accounts in. And they were trading posts. And as Indians were on reservations or were captive, the male, especially the male Indians, would start writing the history of their tribe. And they look like family circus cartoons, some of them, like little dots, like here's where the raiding party went, and here's how many arrows, and you can read them. And they were bound in a book. And a lot of them, we don't think of them like that now because collectors would rip out the pages. And Dartmouth has an incredible collection of these things. But in terms of non-Western, it's a great question.
So I think, for example, the antique Egyptians
Oh, there you go.
or
Right,
Syria, the old Syrian,
right.
the Phoenicians, the
Cave drawings.
Cave drawings.
another.
Yeah. Well, I was just at that. I got to Boston to see that Black Mountain College exhibition,
Yeah.
and Joseph Albers and his wife. They they went to Mexico often, and they were fascinated with hieroglyphics and pictograms, and they talked about this visual language and the boil down of using these images. And of course, like when you're a hammer, the whole world's a nail. So as a cartoonist, I'm like, they're talking comics, and I found that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, it kind of leads into my question. You mentioned like the yellow kids and stuff like that. That artist worked for William Randolph Hearst, who was famous for saying, you give me the pictures, I'll give you the war. And I had a kind of a formative experience in my life when I was working in politics, where in a small town, and there was a very well-known and well-loved cartoonist who did the main panel on the op-ed page every day, and the paper was for one candidate, and I happened to have the misfortune of working for the losing candidate, and I knew the cartoonist pretty well, and so did the losing candidate. And I was standing with the losing candidate and the cartoonist. And the cartoonist was crying. And he was saying, I'm sorry I voted for you. But my boss asked me to do this.
Wow.
And so I was just wondering if since you hadn't been talking about politics too much and cartooning, if you had any takes on this kind of
Wow,
thing.
that's a sad story. It feels like
Yeah.
somebody's so compromised,
Yeah. I mean,
Well, it's funny. The only thing I guess, like in terms of political cartooning, it's really becoming a much not a dead art, but that once upon a time the political cartoonists had wielded so much power, and now it seems the political graphic usually is up over the shoulder of Jon Stewart, or not anymore. But like that's where that kind of like quick little burst of image and take on it. I mean, I still love there's certain cartoonists that I still like, Tom Tolles, and there's Jeff Danziger is of course great, and there's a lot of good political cartoonists. But the way the newspaper works right now is there's not many of them, and they can't afford to have somebody doing that. And also, politics aren't local anymore to the same extent because of the media environment. But I still think that skill of being able to distill amplify. What did I say earlier? Scott McCloud said amplification through simplification. I mean, it's an amazing skill to have, to take a complex issue and kind of boil it down where somebody laughs and recognizes something true in it, and it kind of hits you. And like Nancy, when you have a comic that before you decide whether you read it or not, you've already read it, like that it's like a stop sign. As soon as you look at it, you can't not read it, you know. And you know, Ernie Bushmiller, he's like the master of that. Like that's pretty potent stuff. Yeah. Was that? Should we call one more, or do we gotta?
All of these cartoons look like or appear to be hand drawn. I'm wondering if you see any trends in comics that might force you to add a professor of computer illustration to your faculty.
I think that question, appear to be hand drawn, is very interesting.
Yes.
So this spring, it's going to be a public lecture, but this is this amazing Israeli cartoonist named Rutu Modan. And the cartoon school teams up with Dartmouth every year, and we do a public lecture. And I'm sure it'll be in the paper. But Rutu is an amazing cartoonist. She has graphic novels about, internationally award-winning graphic novels about, you know, the way that the situation in the Middle East kind of takes its toll on a very human level. And Rutu and I, years ago, were on a panel together, some literary thing or another. And we were waiting to get on, and I love her drawing. It seems very warm and expressive. And she says, "Oh yeah, I do it all on a computer." Like, what? And she opened up her computer and she showed me like all the layers and this and that. And I was just like incredulous, like, wow, like, did you ever worry that, you know, it would look cold or mechanical or distance the reader? And in typical forthright Israeli fashion, she said, "I am in charge of the computer. It is not in charge of me." And I kind of get that, right? Like it's a tool. And you know, we have Wacom tablets, and I color. I don't. In my comics, I want to feel intimate and direct, and I don't put a lot of like, you know, certain like Photoshop techniques and fades and this, because for me it kind of makes someone aware of something between me and the reader. But the computer is integral. I just, you know, me personally, that's my aesthetic. But I would say more than half our students don't even go near it. I mean, they do for some assignments, but you know, they're drawing with Wacom tablets and Cintiqs, and you know, they're publishing online, and off they go. You know, so I don't get too hung up on on how they get there, as long as they get what they want. You know, out of the piece. This was really fun. Thank you. Is it like 7 o'clock?